Picture the Strait of Hormuz. It's a narrow strip of water, barely 21 miles wide at its pinch point. On one side, you have the Arabian Peninsula. On the other, the rugged coast of Iran. Every single day, about 20% of the world's oil consumption passes through that tiny gap. Now, imagine a single miscalculation there. A drone flying too low, a speedboat cutting too close to a tanker, a button pressed in a panic. That isn't just a local skirmish, that is the light switch for the global economy flicking off.
And yet, despite the stakes being that terrifyingly high, we seem to be stuck in this perpetual loop with Iran. It's always the same headlines: sanctions, proxies, nuclear thresholds, stern warnings from Washington, defiant rhetoric from Tehran. It feels less like a geopolitical relationship and more like a 70-year grudge match that neither side can afford to win, but neither can afford to lose. I'm Jake, and today we are stripping away the breaking news banner to understand the machinery of this conflict.
It is a grudge match, Jake, but calling it a conflict almost simplifies it too much. It's an ecosystem. The US-Iran relationship isn't just about diplomacy or war. It's a total spectrum confrontation that happens in banks, in cyberspace, in the streets of Beirut and Baghdad, and yes, occasionally in the Strait of Hormuz. To understand the news today, you have to realize we aren't looking at a single event. We are looking at the latest move in a chess game that's been running since the middle of the 20th century.
Right, and that's where I want to start, because whenever I hear political commentary on this, it seems to fall into two camps. One side says Iran is an irrational actor, a mad regime bent on destruction. The other side says they're a rational victim of American imperialism. Surely the truth is messier than that.
It's infinitely messier, and to get why, we have to go back to the ghost that haunts every negotiation room, 1953. You cannot understand a single Iranian policy decision today without understanding Operation Ajax. This was when the CIA and British intelligence orchestrated the coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, Iran's democratically elected prime minister.
This was about oil, wasn't it? Nationalization.
Precisely. Mossadegh wanted to nationalize the Iranian oil industry, which was controlled by the British. The West viewed this as a communist-adjacent threat. Panic set in, and they toppled him, reinstalling the Shah as an absolute monarch. For the West, that's a footnote in Cold War history. But for the Islamic Republic, that is the founding trauma. It is the proof that the United States cannot be trusted, that their ultimate goal is always regime change, regardless of what they say on paper.
So when we see hardliners in Tehran shouting, "Death to America," it's not just theatrical performativity, it's rooted in that specific memory?
It's performative, certainly, but it's a performance built on a very real scaffold of grievance. Fast forward to 1979, the Islamic Revolution. The Shah is ousted. The U.S. embassy is seized, and 52 Americans are held hostage for 444 days. That is the American trauma. That's the moment the U.S. psyche decided Iran was the enemy. So you have these two defining wounds, 1953 for them, 1979 for us. And every piece of news you see today, whether it's about nuclear centrifuges or ballistic missiles, is filtered through those two lenses.
Okay, so the trust is non-existent, but let's look at the mechanics of how they actually fight, because they aren't fighting a conventional war. We aren't seeing Iranian tanks rolling across borders. We see, well, what do we see? It's this weird mix of militias and drones.
This is what military analysts call the grey zone, or asymmetric warfare. And the Iranians have perfected a specific doctrine for this. They call it forward defense. The logic is brutal, but simple. If we fight our enemies, we fight them in their cities, not in Tehran. We fight in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Beirut, in Sana'a.
So that explains the axis of resistance we keep hearing about. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the militias in Iraq. They aren't just allies, they're a defensive perimeter.
They are a buffer zone. Think of it this way. Iran's conventional military, their air force, their tanks, is actually quite old. They've been under sanctions for decades. They can't buy modern fighter jets easily. If they went toe-to-toe with the US Air Force, they'd be obliterated in days. They know this, so they invested in asymmetry. They built a network of proxies, the axis of resistance, and armed them with cheap, effective technology like ballistic missiles and those Shahed drones we've seen so much of recently.
That's a critical point on the technology. I remember reading about the cost difference. An American air defense missile might cost $2 million. An Iranian-designed drone might cost $20,000. That economic disparity changes the battlefield, doesn't it?
It fundamentally breaks the calculus of modern warfare. It's the cost-exchange ratio. If the US or its allies have to fire a multi-million-dollar interceptor to stop a glorified model aeroplane carrying explosives, Iran wins the economic war, even if the drone is shot down. This is the legacy of Qasem Soleimani, the Quds Force commander the US assassinated in 2020. He spent 20 years building this architecture where Iran can project power across the Middle East without technically invading anyone.
And that gives them plausible deniability. When a militia in Iraq attacks a US base, Tehran can shrug and say, nothing to do with us, mate. But surely the US sees right through that.
Of course they see through it, but it creates a diplomatic hurdle. Does the US want to bomb Iran proper because a militia in Iraq fired a rocket? That's a massive escalation. That's World War III territory. So the US usually responds by hitting the proxy, not the patron. And the cycle continues. It's a carefully managed equilibrium of violence.
Let's pivot to the other battlefield, which I think is even more fascinating. The economic one. We hear about sanctions so often that word has lost its meaning. It sounds like a fine you pay. But the reality on the ground in Iran is devastation, isn't it?
It's economic strangulation. The maximum pressure campaign, which really ramped up after the US left the nuclear deal in 2018, was designed to cut off Iran's oil exports entirely. The impact has been visceral. The Iranian currency, the rial, has collapsed. We're talking about a currency that traded at maybe 32,000 to the dollar in the mid-2010s, now trading at hundreds of thousands to the dollar on the black market.
Who does that actually hurt, though? Does it hurt the Ayatollah in his palace, or does it hurt the shopkeeper in the bazaar?
That is the central tragedy and the main criticism of broad sanctions. It hollows out the middle class. The wealthy elite, the ones connected to the Revolutionary Guard, they control the smuggling networks. When legal trade stops, the black market explodes. And guess who runs the black market? The very people you're trying to sanction. Meanwhile, the middle class, the teachers, the engineers, the people who would theoretically support a more moderate democratic Iran, they are the ones spending their life savings just to buy meat and medicine.
So, perversely, sanctions might actually strengthen the regime's grip by making the population dependent on them for survival.
That is the argument many sociologists make. If you are worried about starving, you don't have time to protest for political liberty. Although we have seen that breaking point. The protests we've seen in recent years are fueled by this economic despair. But the regime has shown it is willing to use absolute brutality to suppress them.
I want to touch on the digital aspect too. We talked about drones, but the first real shot in this modern era wasn't a missile, it was code, Stuxnet.
Stuxnet was a watershed moment, not just for US-Iran relations, but for the history of warfare. Discovered around 2010, it was a cyber weapon, widely attributed to the US and Israel, that physically destroyed Iranian nuclear centrifuges. It made them spin out of control while telling the monitoring screens that everything was normal.
It sounds like science fiction, but what did that do to the Iranian mindset?
It convinced them that they were vulnerable in a new way. And what did they do? They learned. Iran heavily invested in its own cyber capabilities after Stuxnet. Now, Iran is considered a Tier 1 cyber threat. They've gone after U.S. banks, Saudi oil companies, even water infrastructure. Stuxnet slowed their nuclear program down by a few years, but it accelerated their cyber warfare program by a decade.
It seems like every time the West tries to push a button to stop them, whether it's sanctions or cyber attacks, it just mutates the threat into something else. Which brings us to the political commentary. Why is it so hard for the West to find a policy that actually works? We oscillate between let's make a deal and let's crush them.
The oscillation is the problem. In the U.S., policy toward Iran shifts violently every 4 to 8 years, depending on who is in the White House.
One administration signs the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, trading sanctions relief for limits on enrichment. The next administration tears it up and demands total capitulation. If you are a strategist in Tehran, how can you possibly make a long-term deal with Washington? You can't. So you stick to what works: self-reliance, proxies, and the nuclear hedge.
And on the Iranian side, we often hear about reformists versus hardliners. Is that a real distinction, or is it just good cop, bad cop?
It's a real distinction, but within a very narrow cage. The reformists genuinely want better relations with the West and a more open economy, but the hardliners, the principalists, believe that opening up to the West is a Trojan horse for regime change. And here is the irony, Jake. Every time the U.S. takes a hardline, it vindicates the hardliners in Tehran. They can turn to the reformists and say, "See, we told you the Americans would betray us." The collapse of the nuclear deal was a massive political gift to the most radical elements in Iranian politics.
So, where does this end? We have a nuclear program that is advancing. Their breakout time is now measured in days or weeks, not years. We have proxies firing missiles. We have an economy in ruins. Is war inevitable?
War is possible, but I wouldn't say inevitable. Neither side wants a full-scale invasion. The U.S. has zero appetite for another Middle Eastern war, and Iran knows it would lose a direct confrontation. The future is likely exactly what we are seeing now, just intensified. The gray zone becomes the permanent state of affairs. More cyber attacks, more proxy skirmishes, more covert sabotage. It's a management problem, not a problem with a solution.
That's a sobering thought, that this tension isn't a crisis waiting to pass, but the new normal.
It is the new normal, and the danger is that in a gray zone, the lines are blurry. One bad decision, one missile that hits a crowded barracks instead of an empty warehouse, and the management fails. That is what keeps analysts up at night. Not the plan, but the accident.
A fragile equilibrium indeed. We've covered the history, the military doctrine, and the economic pain. It leaves you realizing that the news headlines are really just the tip of a very deep, very cold iceberg. Rachel, thank you for walking us through the complexity.
My pleasure, Jake.
And if you found this deep dive helpful in decoding the noise, share this episode with a friend who's trying to make sense of the headlines.